Hi there and welcome to this, the Rethinking the Human Factor podcast with me, your host, Bruce Hullis. Thank you very much for joining us on the show today. For those of you who are new to the show, what is the show actually all about? Well, the show's all about raising awareness, influencing behaviour, and fostering an organisational culture where information security and data protection are truly valued. Where did the idea for the show come from? Well, really, it's a spin out of over 7.5 years worth of research that I've been performing into rethinking the human factor. And as part of that sort of process of reassessing what the actual challenge was, identifying opportunities for improving how we currently go about addressing the lofty goals of awareness, behaviour and culture within organisations, I really became fully exposed to the broad range of disciplines which could really significantly increase our chances of actually getting the objectives, the business requirements that we're really looking for. Now, the thing with all of these different disciplines is that when I looked what were the disciplines that we had within the industry, the conversations we had within the industry, back then, it was clear there was a real gap between what we needed and what we had. And what this podcast was about is about introducing people who specialize in those disciplines, whether they were from within the security and data protection industry or without, whether they were academics and researchers or they were practitioners. The one thing that binds everybody that we want to come on the show is their willingness to come and share insights and their own experiences of how they have driven changes in levels of awareness, behavior and culture within organizations. Not always about security and data protection, more often not about stuff outside of the industry, but all of it completely relevant when it comes to designing with the human in mind. For the first time in Series 3 of the show, we have got sponsorship and support from the industry. And so I just really want to take this opportunity to thank Jason Haynick from Habituate. Now, Jason is one of the founders at Habituate, and Habituate is an organization that's based out in the United States. But, prior to setting up Habituate, Jason actually worked as an education awareness manager for some really, really big names. And he wanted to address some of the challenges that he had as an education awareness manager. And that's where he went about setting up Habituate. Now, if you want to get in contact with Jason and Habituate, the best ways for you to do that, Jason is highly active on social media. You can find him on LinkedIn, you can find him on Twitter, okay? And you can get in contact with him or any member of the Habituate team by going to www.habituate.com. I'll spell that for you, HABITU, and then the number 8. Very clever. So thank you, Jason, and thank you, Habituate, for sponsoring the show. So for those of you who enjoyed Series 1 and Series 2, we've really gone out of the way to make sure that we've got some absolutely fantastic guests on for Series 3. And one of those guests is with us here on the show now, a lady called Kenda MacDonald. And Kenda actually comes from an organization called Automation Ninjas. Now, I like ninjas and I like automation. So I just thought automatically we've got to get Kenda on the show. The type of work that Kenda's involved in, I've done quite a lot of work as part of my research. And then, to find somebody that can actually pull it all together and express it in a way that I found easy to understand. And so I'm pretty convinced that all of our listeners will find it really easy to understand. It was a case of, got to get her on the show. So Kenda agreed to have a chat. We had a chat. And boy, did we chat. Yeah, I was like, Kenda's going to be great to get on the show. So I asked, she said, yes, she'd love to come on. And so here we have it. So hi, Kenda, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Absolute pleasure. Really buzzing about what the community is going to get from listening to you. Do you want to just tell us something? So we've done the Kenda bit. Tell us a little about Kenda MacDonald. Who are you? What do you do? And what's the journey that you've been on to get to where you are?
I started out originally as a forensic psychology major. That's what I studied originally. And I have since blended and morphed into the marketing world, as you do. So to start this journey, I kind of was studying and paying my way through university. I'm originally from South Africa, and I came to the UK to live and work here. And I was paying my way through uni, and I started working just for wages in a company that did some marketing automation. And it was really interesting. It just pure coincidence of timings. Studying something like forensic psychology, which is so in depth into why we do what we do. And then at the same time, really going in depth and learning an entirely new industry, working in marketing automation. And just by having those two things really juxtapositioned against one another, I was able to see that there was so much in marketing that wasn't catered for in terms of human behavior. We just kind of put stuff out there and just hope that customers are going to like it, they're going to want it, and hope for the best, really. And there's some very base understanding of psychology that seems to be that you should manipulate the living hell out of people and hope that they're going to purchase something. And that seems to have been what's filtered through. And none of the really cool stuff has filtered through. So I tried to get that going in the business I was working in. They weren't up for it at all. They just wanted to get paid and go home. And when that company sort of disappeared, I said, well, do you know what? We're really good at what we do. So why don't we start our own business? And Automation Ninjas was born. And so now we help our customers understand their consumers' behavior. We help them build customer journeys that actually take human behavior into consideration, and then where appropriate, automate them. And it's a lot of fun.
I think it all sort of starts with the forensic psychology. It's the serendipity. You sort of brought that together. You found yourself in a need to earn some money. Okay, so you took this job in marketing, and then when you're in there, you're suddenly like, actually, on reflection, a lot of what I've been trained in and the thing that I'm passionate about, it really applies here. Because, marketing is about influencing behavior, isn't it? It's about getting people to choose one product over another, and it's ideally your product. So there is a distinct link with what the challenges are in my community about marketing security, for example. But then the second point, which I think was really well put, the sense of, working within an organization where the objective was, we deliver the project, and it's almost like we throw it all out there. We communicate to all our audience within the budget that we're given. So it's whether as small or as big as possible. Let's burn the money. Let's throw it out there and let's see what sticks.
Yeah.
And then for me, from a finance perspective, I originally part trained in finance. And I guess the accountant in me would turn around and go, whoa, what's the return on investment on that? And when the point you're making is that, you're coming from that forensic background, you're able to sort of think about, well, actually, what actually works? If your objective is to change behavior, then you've got to surely incorporate something around behavior in that understanding, which is perfectly what you've done. And then you didn't find that it worked within that particular organization. They didn't have the appetite for probably quite a cultural change, actually, I can imagine.
I think so too. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, definitely.
And then so you've gone off and you're doing your own thing. And I think, understanding how consumers' behaviors are formed and influenced is what you're about. And then say, okay, so if we understand that, how can we better design what it is that we do? And that's really what you do. That is pretty much
precisely what we do. I mean, I've got a term that I stick to pretty loyally, and that is conscious consumerism, and that it's not in any psychology, particularly in forensic psychology, ethics is really important in terms of you've got to be doing something for the right reason, and you've got to make sure that morally you're aligned. Now, there's a few different reasons from a behavioral standpoint that you should do that anyway, not just because that's the right thing to do, but also because consumers can sniff it out. We've survived as a species by picking out and finding the people that can't be trusted and staying away from them. So why try and do anything different in your marketing? But the way that we see it is if we can help consumers make the right decisions, and we can do that morally and ethically, we can help them make the right decision for them, then we've done the best thing possible. And that's also great for marketing, because in marketing, you want someone to choose between A or B. And what most companies end up doing is they end up putting materials together and information together that makes it hard for people to choose. And we want the opposite of that. We want the choice to be really, really obvious. And obvious is a double-edged sword. It's either obviously for you or it's obviously not for you. So rather than getting people to the point where they're stuck with choice paralysis and they can't make a decision, it's making that decision really, really easy for them. And that's what we call conscious consumerism. We're educating the consumer so that they can make the best choice possible. And that is whether or not it's good for them or whether or not it's not for them. And that's really important for us, that you have that strong moral backbone, that you're helping the consumer be conscious about the choice that they're making, not manipulating them to make a choice, because we feel iffy about that and we pick up on that very quickly.
I think it's a really interesting ethics one, because in a lot of the research that I've done around judgment, decision making, and there's some pretty big names out there that I've read from, and I've been lucky enough to interview some pretty big names in that world as well, like Dan Ariely and Susan Weincheck,
Amazing.
for example. That whole issue of ethics is something that comes up, because I think where you come from, the insight, that behavioral insight, is an incredibly powerful tool. And if it's used in a way which is exploitive in some way or other, okay, where it's not for the benefit of the individual. And when I think about choosing between products, and you think, well, actually neither of these products is actually really particularly worth your choice. Then getting people to just consume for consuming purposes when you're actually it's of no real benefit to you.
No.
I think that does raise some really interesting ethical questions, and I know reading books from people like David Helpin at the behavioural unit, the nudge unit, Sunstein, Kahneman, they're all reflecting upon the realization this is an incredibly powerful tool, has to be used in an ethical 100%.
Way. 100%. I mean, the way I see it as a business case, as a pure business case, from the accountancy background, you'll be all over this, is that if you are good to your consumers, you help them make the best choice possible, and you help them make the best consumption possible, make the consumption experience great and easy, and you're doing it for the right reasons, you'll get customer lifetime value. And that's where business profits are. They're in customer lifetime value, getting a customer that comes back. You'll also have customer advocacy, customer loyalty. That's what we want as businesses. We don't just want one sale. We want repeat purchases. We want people to get into the habit of using you as a service. And if you're going to do that, whether it's a single product, whether it's multiple products, whatever the case is, whatever you're selling across whatever industry and whatever grouping, whether it's B2B, B2C, if you can nail, or B2G, if you can nail the customer lifetime value and have loyal customers, then you've made it. But you're only going to do that if you do that for the right reasons, because the second they feel that they've been duped, they're going to, and they can make another choice, they will go make another choice.
Okay, so I'm going to put, because you use some terms there which I think a lot of our listeners won't necessarily understand, so I'm just going to pull you through them. If you could just explain what your take on these individual phrases is, it would be really, really helpful. Customer lifetime value.
So that is the lifetime, that is the amount that someone will purchase with you or will spend with you over their lifetime. So the way I see it is you've got one customer will buy X amount of things over X amount of period. So you work out how much that money is, how much they're going to spend over that time period, what that time period is on average, and then you minus your costs. It gets more complicated than that. You have lots of different ways to work out customer lifetime value, but as its basics is how much they spend with you over a certain period of time minus the costs of acquiring them or keeping them.
Okay. So can I just ask you the question there? Because when we think of the customer like value and how you measure value, the way that you use the metric, which is for your type of customers, and you haven't mentioned anything about your type of customers, which is awesome, because you're not self-promoting, you're here to share insights, but your customers would probably measure value in terms of pounds and pennies or dollars or euros, isn't it? I mean, that's how traditionally your type of customer would measure the value of that lifetime, that relationship with them. Yeah. But could you measure value in other ways? For example, I mean, for me, the one that springs straight to my mind is time is money. Could we measure the value of the lifetime on the relationship based upon time?
Or app usage, if you've got an app. So let's say you've got software in a company. They've paid you a lot of money to get a certain software system into a certain place. Yeah, it's great that you've got the software in place and your contract's done, job done, right? Not necessarily. If the company isn't using the software on a day-to-day basis, they're not going to renew the contract. The amount of times that someone checks into something, the amount of times, there is all sorts of other ways that you can measure that isn't necessarily monetary. So it's whatever metric, I suppose, if you were going to adapt it and make it a more universal formula that didn't just take money into consideration, it's whatever metric is important to you over the time period minus the cost of getting them there, whether that's monetary or effortful. So you could have behavioral lifetime value. You could have time lifetime value. I love that idea of time. How much time can you save someone over a certain time period? How much time can you get them using something? Yeah, you can definitely adapt that.
I mean, it's an interesting one around time. I was having a conversation around packages for people joining organizations. And we were talking about, the actual cost, what the cost, but, the actual salary, your salary that you're able to get within a particular role. And then we sort of started talking about, actually, what about time? What about most of us get limited to somewhere between 20 and 25 days holiday. How much value would somebody put on an extra 5 days at 30?
Isn't that what Uber did? Yeah, you take that relationship of pre-Uber between a customer and a taxi booking service. It's like 20-something steps to actually get to book a taxi, including the exchanging of money once you're inside the taxi. And Uber got it down to 3 steps, which took less than a minute on a phone. And so Uber managed to change people's behavior and change their habits by saving them that time and saving them the effort of going through the process. And so that's how they won. So I don't see why not.
Yeah. Okay, so like customer lifetime value, really important to the listeners there. I'm just like, I think, just that phrase from Kenda, and then when you unwrap it a bit and you think about it, you go, wow, so it doesn't need about money. It could be about other metrics, which then brings me back, to the next question off that is, so how important is it to you when you think about the work that you do about having really clearly defined objectives before you then start the process that you take clients through? Because surely the metrics define the objectives define the metrics, isn't it?
Yeah, 100%. If we can't measure it, if we can't quantify it, we can't change it. So if I have no baseline stats and I have no desired stats, which is what we generally call them, then I can't change behavior because I don't know what I'm changing and I don't know why I'm changing it and I don't know how I'm changing it. So I have nothing to work with, and then it's basically throwing pasta at a wall and seeing which one sticks, basically. And that's not what I'm up for. I want to be able to look at something and go, this is where we're going, this is what we're trying to achieve. Then let's define the best path to making that happen, because it will change the path drastically depending on what you want. If you've got a database of 100,000 and you only want 5 more users, then you could probably annoy the hell out of everyone else by sending 20 push notifications or a bunch of emails or picking up the phones. If you just want to get those 5, you don't care about all of the rest of the 995,000 people. But if you want to get the majority of those people over the line, then you've got to do it in a slightly different way. You've got to make sure. So it completely changes the customer journey the whole way through, just depending on what that desired outcome is.
So the other phrase you used was customer advocacy. Do you want to just sort of explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, sure. So customer advocacy is kind of the endpoint that everybody wants. It's the customer that is not only so happy with your services or your products or whatever they've just experienced, but they want to tell other people about that. So they're the kind of people. And now I always get really irritated with those sort of surveys that come up and say, would you tell your friends and family about the service? Yeah. Because it's like, what if it's not appropriate? Would I tell my friends and family about the heavy metal concert that I just went to? I wouldn't tell my family, but I might tell my friends. If it might not be appropriate for the setting. Or if you work in a really technical area and most of your friends and family don't know about all that things, are you going to tell them about the piece of software that you used? Probably not. But you would be an advocate if you went to a highly technical conference and you saw people and you were like, oh my goodness, you have no idea the software that I just found solves that problem that we've all been having for ages. I got to tell you all about it, which is kind of what happened with Slack, right? It's not the sort of thing we tell our friends and family, but now we're advocating it to other people like us. And so customer advocacy is all about saying, being so excited and so happy about a product or service that when you find that other person that's like you just have to share it. You have to tell them about it because you know it's going to make their life better too. And we all want customer advocates because they'll bring in anywhere between, I can't remember precisely, don't quote me on the figures. I think it's between 2 and 30 something referrals over a 7-year period if you have an advocate, depending on the type of product that you've got. So you can have that kind of one person can bring you in like an additional 30 customers. It's the best advertising you'll ever have. So that's what we're looking for.
And I think just listening to you explain that, you're just like, okay, yeah. First thing that springs to mind, people like you. So it's that sense of people like Kendra, okay, will probably like, let's say, metal, same type of music, okay? Yeah. And that comes from the fact that, we are all we are, whether we acknowledge it or not, heavily influenced by the groups that we associate with.
Yeah.
And that's part of your psychology background, is that forensic psychology is understanding at a level, this is an influencing factor. And if you take that into consideration, you can start to shape things.
100%. I mean, we all like little boxes. I know we always say, they think outside of the box, don't label me. But you'll find that all of the people that don't like being labeled will cluster together. And they become the people.
Unlabeled, aren't they?
Yeah, all unlabeled, but they'll become the unlabeled group.
If you're part of the labeled group, then you're part of the unlabeled group, surely.
One of my favorite things that I realized coming out of high school, I was a heavily alternative child in a very conservative country. So South Africa is quite conservative, very into all the alternative things. And when I moved to the UK, it's a lot less conservative here, and it was great seeing, how free everybody was with their expressions. And I immediately realized that I'd moved from a school where I hated the cliques that had developed in school straight into another type of clique. And it was fascinating watching the alternative community in the UK and all its individual cliques. And whether we like it or not, we have evolved as a social species, and that reliance on social, that has meant that we have survived. And so we have shared childbearing, we have shared bringing up children, we have shared gathering of resources, and like groups have stuck together. And as those life groups have stuck together, they have survived better than the groups that didn't stick together. So even though we don't like being labeled, we will still gravitate to like groups because that means that our genes have a better chance of being passed on. So you can't quite stereotype people, but you can.
Yeah. We had one of our guests, a guy called Gert-Jan Hofstede. His family had done so much work in the area of culture, and there are a number of other people in the research. Have you heard of him, Gert-Jan?
Yeah.
I mean, the sort of thing you're talking about, they're talking about culture, and then the whole group thing, that group dynamics growing within culture, and then you speak to people you're doing psychology, and you're like going, okay, and it's almost the relationship between culture and psychology. It is, if it isn't the same, it is almost the same. Yeah, it's just a different spelling.
Pretty much.
Yeah. And you just, that's one of the beautiful things, though, when you sort of see culture as being separate to maybe psychology and behavior, and then you start to realize, actually, it is pretty much the same thing.
Pretty much.
Yeah, and you talk to culture people, and they go, oh, have you listened to this psychologist here who's written this book or done this TED Talk, or you need to go and listen. And they're like, oh, yeah, that's what I've been saying for years, and I'm not a psychologist. And they go, yeah, I know, but they've been saying it for years, and they're not a cultural specialist. They're not like us, and they're like, actually, let's just blend you two together, okay?
I mean, I see psychology as an umbrella term anyway. It covers so many different areas and so many different things. Basically, anytime it's got anything to do with human behavior or the human mind, then it's psychology. So if you think about it that way, almost everything we do has an element of psychology in it, because the one element that is the same through every culture, through every diversity, is that it's got a human involved in it.
Yeah, and I think that was part of what inspired me with my work, was what is the consistent between in security. It was about we talked about the human factor, and he was like, well, what are the consistent? Because people used to talk about the cultural clashes that would be going on and all these sort of things. And you go, yeah, let's get down to what we all have in common. And for me, it was like, well, here, the human body. And you looked at that human body, and then you're part of okay, and all the different constituent parts. And then there was the brain, and then it was like, okay, and then it was, now we're getting into how we actually process and receive it, process it, store it, subconscious decision making, conscious decision making, and you're suddenly like, oh wow, and I think it makes, and I think the great thing there is it makes you rethink, and you're like, oh, okay, maybe I could do this slightly differently to the way that I'm doing
100%. I think that's probably, the advances we've had in the last 10 to 15 years in neuroscience alone, in behavioral economics has been phenomenal. The understanding that we've had of how people make decisions, just because of the fact that technology has progressed so far. So all the things that Kahneman said, all the things that Tversky said, Thaler and Sunstein said, we have proof for now, in terms of we have the brain scans to prove what's going on. So there's just been this massive boom to show us how we actually behave, and I don't think that's trickled down to anywhere other than behavioral economics, which is a shame.
It's a shame, but I think I can sense that things are changing. You're very much about the customer journey. Do you want to explain what you mean by the journey? This is not something you can get from TripAdvisor, is it? Just to be clear, I just want to make sure I can just bang it in quickly and know, oh, okay, yeah, that's TripAdvisor. We're done. We've solved the challenge of the human factor. Do you want to explain to us what you mean by the customer journey?
So every time a customer has to do something, your ideal customer has to go through the process of buying something, or utilizing your product, or utilizing your service, or making a decision. So even if they're not actually purchasing something and it's not a marketing thing, every time that customer has to do something, it forms part of a journey. When you're wanting to take someone from A to B to C to D to E, that is a journey. So things like user experience form part of the customer journey. Things like marketing form part of the customer journey. Even after the point of sale, marketing is still part of the customer journey. So the customer journey is everything that a consumer has to do to buy and utilize a product. That is the customer journey. That entire process from A all the way through to Z is the customer journey.
Okay. Can I just, there's part of me who wants to say, I've had this phrase for years, and I think it sort of came from my sort of marketing background. I would say, if security was a product, would you buy it? And if you bought it, would you buy it again? Okay. And I guess for me, when I was thinking, in my mind, I'm thinking of a journey. Yeah. But the part of the journey that really, really meant something to me was, once you consume the product, would you come back and buy it again?
There you go. That's advocacy or loyalty or customer lifetime value.
Okay. So that's the difference, because when we first spoke, we spoke about the customer journey, I thought, is the journey about getting them to buy the product, or is it the journey about getting them to buy the product and for them to come back? And the return leg, by the sound, is the advocacy bit, and the journey bit is the bit that gets you to the point where they've got to make a decision about whether or not they want to buy the product again.
That's 100%. I think my biggest frustration, and this happens with small businesses a lot more than the larger companies, but you'd be surprised in the larger companies too. What you generally tend to have happen is that you spend a lot of effort, and particularly in marketing, and this is a fault that I see in marketing all the time, is that you spend a lot of time and effort getting someone to buy something. And then the second they bought something, you go, good job. And then you run back to the beginning of the cycle and try to get someone else to buy something, forgetting about the fact that once someone has purchased something, that's only halfway through their journey. So ages ago, Procter & Gamble got a bunch of research together, and they were talking about the moments of truth. So this was for traditionally when you walk into a shop and you see a shelf of stuff and you pick up a product that you're going to buy. That is the first moment of truth, when you're holding something in your hand and you decide you're going to buy it. You put it in your cart, you go actually buy it. Then you get home and you're going to use that product. That is the second moment of truth. The point where you actually come to utilize that product or service is the second moment of truth. And it's the combination of these two that helps you decide whether or not you're going to purchase it again. So the second moment of truth is the quality, the consistency of the product. And the first moment of truth was the ease of buying it. And then Google came along and sort of put the cat amongst the pigeons by creating a very easy way to search the internet and find information. And what Google wanted to figure out, and this was all the way back in 2011, I believe, is they wanted to figure out what happened before someone got to that point. And what they uncovered was that there is this massive moment of research, and that is the zero moment of truth. And that's what they coined it. And that's when someone is deciding they're going to buy something. They go online because we have access to the internet and we research that thing. And then we might go off and buy that thing. So that's the first moment of truth, and then use that thing, which is the second moment of truth. And it's the combination of all three of these that determines whether or not someone's going to purchase something again.
So that purchasing something again isn't a moment of truth? No,
that's not. That just becomes customer lifetime value at that point. Because that's the second purchase. I mean, if you wanted to give it a term, we could call it the third moment of truth. Whether or not someone buys it again, I don't see why not.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was just thinking. I was like, moment of truth, the concept, well, we get them to buy it, but actually we want
See, why didn't we have this conversation before I wrote my book? Then I could have included that in my book and seemed really clever.
Just credit me with it. That'll be absolutely fine. Okay. Yeah. Well, Google found the zero.
Yeah.
And then Kendra finds the third moment of truth is if they come back and buy it again.
Excellent.
Is there more value? I think it'd be an interesting one, actually, if they did some research. That if you think about that lifetime value, there is a value in getting somebody to buy the product. I suspect that the majority of the value comes in the repeat purchase afterwards.
That is where you are 100% correct, because Bain & Co. actually did some research on this, and they looked at the most profitable companies out there, and what they discovered was that if companies focused on just reducing churn, so reducing the amount of people that leave, that don't use a product or service, that don't renew something or don't buy a second time, so that's the churn rate, how much they churn out. If they just focused on reducing churn by 5%, they could increase their profits by up to 95%.
Whoa!
Which is just blew my mind the first time I saw that stat. So there has been a significant amount of research done into that, and it's 700% cheaper, might be 680%, but something percent cheaper to get an existing customer to buy a second time than it is to get a new one to purchase.
And this is what Bain and
Co.
Bain and Co. Oh, you can tell I'm writing this down because I'm speaking slowly.
I've got to go look that up. In fact, I'm just having a little whiz through my book now. I'm going to see if I can find the exact. Here we go. So here's the quote. Bain & Company found that businesses that focus on customer lifetime value and retain just an additional 5% of customers can increase their profits between 25 and 95%. And that is in the I can't pronounce this dude's name, Reichheld, A Prescription for Cutting Costs from Bain & Co.
You talk about 5%. When I think of 5%, because I'm a huge believer in marginal gains, 5% to me is like, wow. 25, 95% is like, that's just ridiculous. But it's the fact that you can have such a marginal thing, which appears marginal, can actually have such a massive impact on the metrics that, in this case, you're measuring profit margin. I think that's really interesting. That the whole concept of there's a cost to getting them on board. There's a value in getting somebody on board, but then it's the keeping them on board, which is where the main bit of the value is. So if you measure it in terms of pounds and pennies, or dollars and cents, or euros, or but if you measure it something differently in terms of time or other things, I think the principles are probably going to transfer over into that as well. The sense of you're going to get a lot more value from that relationship that you developed after the initial purchase. So that in itself tells you can't stop.
No.
When somebody's bought your product.
Here's from the same study, right? So they also identified that repeat customers will spend more and will generate larger transactions the longer they stick around. So they will generate a 67% larger purchase in months 31 to 36 than in months 0 to 6. There's quite a lot of numbers in there. But the fact that somebody is going to consistently be spending more money the longer they stick around as well, just amazes me. I love that. It's the prescription for cutting costs by Bain & Co. It was a great report that they ran. And I ended up basing almost an entire chapter of my book on it because it was so good. It's just absolutely huge what you can achieve if you're just good to your existing customers and get them to stick around for longer.
Why do you think on a psychological level that is the case? I mean, that's where you come from, isn't it? It's when you take away the data you've just been sharing, and some people say, well, of course that's the case. There are adverts out there which are saying, I think there's been some research recently about, definitely something I've heard on the radio recently where they're talking about how much customers overpay. Once they're a customer, that whole thing about my insurance, if I was a new customer, I'd be able to get a better rate than being an old customer. And there is that thing. So why do you think, from your perspective, from a science psychology perspective, why do you think that happens, that this truth, as it were, evolves, that people will basically choose, once they've bought the product, if they've had a great experience, they'll be like, do you know what? I'll have more of that and I'll be more of an advocate. Why do you think that's?
There's a couple of different biases that all come together. So ways that the brain works, basically. There is the sunk cost fallacy. That is basically where you've put a lot of time in, you've put a lot of effort into doing something, so you're not going to change and you're not going to do something different because you have put that much time and effort into doing that thing. So even when you cut your losses, you don't, because you put so much time and effort into it. So I think there's part of that, but then there's also the mere exposure effect. So this is why big brands spend so much money just on creating adverts that you see repeatedly. So the mere exposure effect is the fact that you will like something more when you see it repeatedly. So you kind of develop a better relationship with something the longer you spend or see that thing, and you have more positive relations towards it. So I think there's a couple of different things that go into that, and that will start building that. And the more you dig into it, the more you'll be able to pick out that will help you understand that. But at the end of the day, I think we like relationships. We are a social species and we want that relationship. And if we found a good relationship, we're going to stick with it.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. I mean, the value from a cultural perspective, culture is very much about relationship. And then when you understand the role of culture in terms of how it influences behavior, again, this is just the forming of relationships, that we've spoken about earlier today about, your own group. So you when you were younger, more of an alternative thing. So there would have been a group in South Africa that you closely associated with. They would have been having an influence upon the choices and decisions that you were making. You moved to the UK, there would have been an alternative group for sure. But then, there are lots of alternative groups, slightly different, almost like niches. And all of them these are all relationships. You relate. You have your identity, you associate with an identity, you make it your own. We like to think that we form our own identity, but actually quite often it's something that we get pulled towards. Now, some of our listeners will have understood the phrase. You used the word biases, okay? Some of our listeners would have hopefully listened to all of our previous guests who talked about biases. But can you just, for those of it who have maybe downloaded this episode for the first time, they've maybe even heard of the phrase biases. Can you just explain what you mean by biases?
Sure. So the brain has lots of different rule sets to help it understand the world around it. And we create lots of rule sets for pretty much everything, from driving through to using a pen, through to reading, through to making purchase decisions. We have lots of little rule sets, and sometimes those rule sets go a little bit wrong, or there are ways that the brain interprets some of these rule sets, and they can be repeated. And if they are repeated corruptions in making errors, then we call these cognitive biases, where there are weird things that the brain always does. So for instance, we see something repeatedly and for whatever reason, no logic behind it, we like that thing more just because we've seen it more frequently. That is what we call a bias.
So that's the availability bias, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so that's an interesting one, because I think from a brand perspective, a marketeer's perspective, how there's been quite a change in terms of making sure that when you buy a product, that maybe, like, you know how they put it in a nice bag and it's got the name of the brand on the outside of the bag, and it's all about, you're walking. It's funny because you're walking around and you're basically acting as an advert, and you've paid for the privilege, which is completely the wrong way around.
But let's look at Gucci, right? Gucci or Dolce & Gabbana, those handbags and items of clothing, but particularly the handbags that they create, they're no better than a plastic bag. They have the same function as a plastic bag. You put your stuff in it and you take it from point A to B. But your social grouping is very important. And having a certain standing in your social grouping is very important. And if you are the sort of person who likes a Dolce & Gabbana handbag or a Gucci handbag, and you turn up for tea with your lady friends and you have a plastic bag, what's going to happen to your social grouping? It's going to fall apart pretty quickly if that's what they base all of their assumptions on. However, if you turn up with the newest handbag and you look the part and you fit in with your social grouping, you're going to feel really at ease, and the brain is going to release lots of dopamine, and it's going to be really happy, right? Because you've done all the right things. So you're going to be all loved up on different chemicals because you fit in really nicely with that social grouping. So some of those things can be great, and consumers are quite happy to have them. Like, I'm sure you've seen photographs of celebrities with all their shopping that they're carrying around with them. Now there are people that even when they go into slightly lower end shops that don't have the price tag where the celebrities will be purchasing, that they will give them bags so that people can carry lots of little bags around with them because they feel like they fit more in with that social grouping now. So there is some weird stuff that goes on with regards to social grouping as well with those bags that have the advert on the outside of them.
So it's not just advertising. I mean, it is about. And I think all brand people would argue this, that there is a value in pretty much everything. If it makes somebody, if it influences their behaviour, then surely there is some sort of value. Yeah. Even if it's just to them as an individual level. And the thing is, we naturally as humans we attribute stuff to people. So we might attribute a particular behaviour, like being seen to be seen with the right bags in your hand, that type of thing. Yeah. So we might attribute a behaviour to that, but then the person who's carrying the bag will justify that behaviour. Yeah. And they'll see it as perfectly logical, whereas other people will see it as not being logical, and it's irrational, and they'll attribute what to some people might be considered to be negative values or beliefs or attitudes there as well. So let's get back to the you mentioned about some a couple of biases. You talked about the sunk costs. That's where you've invested so much into something rather than see it as a failure. And I go, okay, we've spent all this time and effort, okay, but quite frankly, we're going to continue with this rather than draw a line underneath it, accept the knock on the chin, and let's find an alternative way. How is that different to the IKEA effect in the sense, or is it different, or is it complementary? The sense of we tend to overvalue something that we own, that we have contributed to putting together. Are these the same thing, or are they two sides of the same coin? I think they contribute to one another and complement one another, but I don't think they're the same thing. And the reason I don't think they're the same thing is because one's positive and one's negative. So in the one, it's curbing a negative behavior. So the sunk cost is you're continuing with something that is detrimental to your well-being, whether it's financially, whether it's by time, whatever way, you're continuing something that is not good for you. And at that point, being a survival mechanism, the brain should really step in and go, stop doing that. But the brain doesn't. It carries on because you've put resources into it and you don't want to waste those precious resources. Whereas with the IKEA effect, we're thinking something is worth more just because we've touched it.
as if we've got the Midas touch. So it's almost like a positive bias in that respect, because we value that resources more and we're less likely to give it away because of the fact that it's ours. So I think that they complement one another, but I would say that they're different.
Okay.
I mean, I've got some guidelines on the different types of biases, because there's quite a few, and by quite a few I mean hundreds.
Yeah. Somebody asked me, I attended a workshop, and they said, could you provide us with a list of biases? I said, well, look, first of all, there's the known ones, and then there's the unknown knowns, and then there's the, okay, that. And they said, well, it would be great if you could just provide it, with a list. And I was like, okay, it's a big list. Not sure what you're going to do with the rest of your day. But
Here you go. I mean, I've got the cognitive bias codex printed out on my wall.
Oh, it's awesome.
It's great, isn't it? It's such a great.
I mean, they talk about beautiful infograph. I'm majorly into infographics. One of the things, part of my research was about understanding why infographics work. That is just in fact, that is what I pointed this individual to. I said, look, for copyright reasons, we've got our own stuff. I said, and we can't just send that out. There is this. I think it's under Creative Commons license, Google, and you're going to have a look at it, and it's beautiful. And the fact that how they've used the colours and then break it down.
They've done a really good job with it. They've done a really good design job with it.
How did you get it printed off? I mean, I'm just thinking, print it. How big is it?
It's A0.
Oh, wow.
It is huge. I actually have two of them. I have one that has the codex itself and then all the meanings.
Okay.
And then I have the other one that is just the codex. So I got one on the one wall and one on the other wall, because I am a bit of a freak, but I will gladly accept that.
Well, that's choice architecture. You've basically designed an environment with, to influence how you're thinking, surrounded by the codex is a pretty awesome way of doing it.
Yeah, I mean, that's my life, pretty much. Well, I mean,
what would you say has been one of the major things that you've seen change? I mean, you've come from that marketing background. So in my industry, there's been a pull towards trying to market security more effectively. And I think what they mean by trying to market, there's key things, developing communications campaigns. So here's our security product, policies, process, procedures. We're going to communicate this to people, make them aware, and with the objective of driving their behavior. Or we communicate content to people in the form of maybe education, and then training people on that, and that's going to drive behavior. What do you think has been the thing that you've seen the biggest change in the last maybe 2 years around the role of getting your content right? Because a lot of what you do is about, it's defining the journey, but then you've got to have the content for the different stages of the journey, haven't
content. I think in the last 2 years, we've just started to understand how crucial content is to the buyer's journey, to the consumption process, to the enjoyment of something. It's one of my biggest bugbears that when you purchase something, all the lovely marketing goes away. Like, no, I want to know how to consume my product in the best way possible. In fact, after purchase, there is a second massive spike. It's not as big as that initial 0 moment of truth, but there is a second massive research spike as into how best to utilize the product or service or whatever it is that someone has just purchased or got their hands on. And I think we're only really starting to understand now how important content is to that journey. And so while I've seen more people create more content, I think I've seen more rubbish content than ever before. And I think we're finally starting to, Google is driving this. Google is driving understanding the content that your consumers want. We have the data to understand what consumers want. We are breeding a consumer that is very, very demanding of information. And it's just about providing that information in the best way possible. And I think the thing that we do wrong is we create content about ourselves. And by about ourselves, I mean, whenever we're creating something, we tend to create content that is about the product or service that we do. It's about the thing that you can buy. It's about the company, and it's not about the consumer. And I think we're seeing that transition away now slowly. into content just about the consumer. So how to make the consumer's life easier, how to make the consumer more conscious, how to make the consumer or help the consumer make decisions. So it's almost like, do you know the hero's journey?
Yes, I do know the hero journey, but maybe some of our listeners would like to be
Enlightened.
educated on the matter, or excited and educated on the matter.
So the hero's journey, practically every big blockbuster movie that you will have seen goes through the hero's journey. And the hero's journey is, I can't remember each and every stage, but if you think of any major Star Wars movie, because that's, big at the moment, you'll have the hero will come in, or the person will start their journey. There'll be a problem, then a guide will get introduced. The guide will help them solve the problem, and then the hero will overcome the challenge, whatever the challenge is. There'll be another point of lowness, of difficulty, and then the guide will help them again excel past, and the hero will find themselves, and then the movie ends on a happy note.
Yeah,
that's what we call the hero's journey. And what tends to happen is when we're creating content, we think of ourselves as the hero, the company as the hero. We're the amazing, knight in shining armor that's come in to save the day. But at the end of the day, the consumer is the hero. And the reason that the Star Wars blockbusters and all these big movies work so well is that the main character is someone that you can understand and you feel like you are like. You want to be like that person. You see qualities that person has as qualities of your own. So your consumer is the hero. And what you are as a business or as a solution provider is the guide. You're the person who helps them overcome their obstacles, but it's them, it's the hero that's overcoming the obstacle. It's the hero that's winning at the end of the day. And so when we're creating content, we should be taking the hero's journey into consideration, making sure that we're creating content for our consumers, making them feel like the hero, and just being the guide that helps get them through the process.
And I think it's really interesting because, when you talk about the journey and you use the word hero, I think from a cultural perspective, one of the key things that sticks out in all the sort of national cultures, but not just the national cultures, but even on cultural dynamics like faith. There's interpretation of hero. Most nation states have heroes. Most cultural groups which might traverse or might be spread over a number of different nation states have heroes. Faiths have sort of heroes within them. And so that whole thing of, the importance of hero from a cultural level is really, really clear. I think one of the things I always remember was the evidence of, good news stories and heroes. And I know within the security industry, we often use the phrase of security ambassadors.
Yeah.
Or, security heroes. And it's that whole, it is such a strong concept. It is that strong. And so what you're sort of arguing for there is that actually the hero and creating a narrative around that, which is the hero's journey, and then trying to see how you develop your content to support that.
That's right. That's the narrative that goes the way through it, the tone that you should be employing, the story that you're crafting through it, but then at all points having data to validate that in terms of that the content is actually something that consumers are wanting to hear about, based on what they're searching on. So really easy thing to do is to grab your search term, chuck it into a keyword analysis tool and see how many people are searching for that keyword. That will give you very quick, very easy validation as to whether or not this content is something that people want to see in that format. So basically validating with data, because there's so much data now, we should be using that data. And then building a journey through that, making sure that you're making your consumer, your end consumer feel like a hero.
You talked there about data, and I think this is an interesting one because I think when we first spoke, we both shared that view that this is data-driven science to enable the design of things much more effectively, and I guess that brings us back to a challenge that sometimes the system. I mean, you've mentioned that the data is more readily available now. But do you come across the situations where, in theory, this would, if we could gather this data, it would tell us a really interesting story, but the systems aren't there in place. Because, we think about Google, and a lot of your work is done via, interaction online.
Yes.
So, the tech has made a leap there, which enables us to gather that data. I think one of the challenges that we would face within my particular industry is how do we develop information systems internally within organizations? Because a lot of the investment is made into, doing the sort of stuff that you do, which is winning customers, retaining customers. And because that's a revenue and profit generator, the investment in the systems that you use to both deliver, but also to monitor and measure and then tweak, there is a business case for that. Whereas to actually, I think one of the biggest challenges that we face is that, our market as security professionals is an internal market. And with that in mind, most boards would be very much of the opinion that if it's bringing new customers in and it's adding to the bottom line, it's a lot easier to have a business case. When it's about trying to get your own internal customer on board, if you're asking us to invest in information systems which maybe go beyond the keeping it operational, just delivering, that's a challenge. And I'm just wondering whether or not you had any views. Is this a perfect science, i.e., it's all down to data, or do you think there is room to be able to say, well, look, if you apply the principles of what we've already learned from the outward facing side, then surely there's going to be rub-off internally?
Oh, 100%. I would never, ever take anyone's advice if they said that this is all an exact science. Because it's not an exact science. It is backed by data, and we're learning more every day. But everything that we're learning is so shocking based on what we've learned previously and what we thought we'd figured out, and the data and the technology is helping us understand that, helping us sort it out. But I think this is applicable everywhere. It really is applicable everywhere, and particularly. One of my favorite things is if you're ever getting difficulty buying in for anything to do with information systems, is just switch them off for a little bit. And you'll see how quickly you get that budget back. But don't take that advice. That's terrible advice. You'll get fired.
Well, I think it's very good use of the availability bias. You go, bang, let's turn that one off. Okay, everyone's shouting. Okay.
So, I mean, if you come back to, there are three main groupings of biases, right? So we've already spoken about availability, but there are anytime that the brain needs tangibility. So the brain needs things to be really obvious, and it needs to be really clear. If it's really obvious and really clear, it will make a good choice, right? But if it's not really obvious and not really clear, that's when you have biases come in place, and then there are biases that affect our understanding of that. So that's an area where we have bias in. You also have immediacy biases, so anything to do with time and any time pressure. We like immediate rewards rather than later ones, and I think that's where information systems have difficulty, and it's not tangible and it's not immediate. And then third, there's also the certainty. Now, I think that's where information systems are always going to have good things. They're very certain, they're very sure, they're a very secure thing. But because they're not immediately available when you're recalling things in your head, and they're not tangible and something that a business can touch and see. Whereas when you're bringing new customers on, you can touch and you can see that new customer. You can touch and you can feel the money. It's tangible. It's understandable. The information system isn't. So I think if you're going to try and get buy-in, those are the two areas that you need to focus on being really clear. So helping businesses understand, or helping that board understand how tangible it is, making it tangible, making it clear, and getting a good use case together that shows that tangibility and also gives some immediacy that this actually needs to happen now because that is happening. I'm sure that after any time when something happens, any other business gets hacked, even if it's got nothing to do with security, suddenly IT becomes a priority again. And that's because it's immediate and it's tangible, because that's just happened to that company and everyone's scared. And it's how do you turn that into a good use case?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we did an interview in series 2, right towards the end, with a guy called John Cotter. And he talks very much about, key steps to bring around change in anything, and one of those was to do with developing a sense of urgency.
Yeah.
When you read what he means by urgency, to most people, you'd be like, "Oh my, that is so extreme." But sometimes you really need that. People get knocked out of their comfort zone. It's only like, I remember this. It only happened 3-4 weeks ago. But there is this point where I think there was some research about how quickly people forget.
Information decays really fast. I mean, the cognitive bias codex that you're talking about groups it into four areas: too much information, not enough meaning, what should we remember, and the need to act fast. And if you're not hitting any of those points, which I'm afraid to say anything to do with information is not going to hit any of those points. If it's not hitting any of those points in terms of what is important for that board member, it's not going to be retained in the way that you want it to. So you've got to tap into what's important to them.
Yeah, and that comes back to the one-size-all type of approach to trying to influence behaviour. It doesn't actually really work, does it? Think about the journey in terms of the value. So a lot of my work is, well, what's your objective out of this? Yeah. And helping people get their head around it, and then trying to put metrics on it. And I think often that's about helping the customer understand, what do you want in the first place? Or what do you think you want? Because I think that can sometimes be different as well, in the sense of, you say you want this, but is that really what you want? Which makes me want to break out into a Spice Girls song. So, Kenda, I think what you're talking about there is that really it's a reflection on the fact. I think, and there, it's something that most people recognise, is the fact that one message doesn't fit all, which would also be one approach to engaging with people and trying to influence behaviour on that customer journey doesn't suit all. You have really got to be thinking about the individual in mind, haven't you?
Yeah, 100%. You have to have a really clear target audience, and you have to you have to really understand what they care about. I mean, the perfect example of that is the Prince's Parable. Have you heard of that one?
The Prince's Parable? No, I haven't. Or I might have, but I'm atrocious with name. It's just like I can listen to a song and go, I recognise that, and then somebody will tell me, do you know the title? Do you know this track? And I'm like, I don't know that. And then they play it to me, and I'm like, oh yes, I know that. Yeah. So this is possibly going to fall into one of those categories, isn't it? Go for it.
The idea of the Prince's Parable is that there is a car company, and the car company is trying to advertise to to an audience, right? And it's put together this amazing advert, and it's decided that it's looking for people that fit a certain criteria, and the criteria are as follows. So they're a luxury car company, and they want to find males between the ages of 65 and 70. They want them to be based in and around London, because that's where the showroom is. They want them to be married. These people should have adult children, so they'll spend some money on themselves. They want these people to be wealthy with a high income, because it's luxury cars. And they want these people to specifically enjoy high performance vehicles. But they also want to kind of have these people support charities and causes, so that they'll be swayed by the company's charitable work. And they also want them to travel and enjoy the finer things in life, right? So from an advertising perspective, that sounds really keyed in.
Yeah.
Except if the car company finds just two princes who fit this criteria, and they try sell them both the same car, they're going to have a really hard time. And here's why. So here's two people, male, born in 1948. They spend a lot of time around London. They're on their second marriage. They both have two children. They're both successful and wealthy. They're self-employed, and they have a disposable income. They both love dogs and high-performance cars. They both enjoy traveling, sports, and fine wine, and they like to holiday specifically in the Alps. And they indulge in music with a soft spot for charities that they support. Okay, so that sounds really defined. It sounds all like really nicely put together. But you wouldn't want to sell them the same car, because one of the princes is the Prince of Wales. And the other prince is the Prince of Darkness, Ozzy Osbourne.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, you have limited it,
Yeah,
haven't you,
so I mean,
really?
the thing between those two is those are actual facts, by the way. That's actual facts, how similar the two of them are. Both born in the same year, both like all pretty much the same things. But if you look at the two of them, they're so diverse and they care about phenomenally different things. And that's what we call psychographics. So the psychographics, the demographics are all the normal stuff. And that's what we tend to use when we're creating marketing materials and we're trying to target people and we're trying to kind of get this one size fits all thing going on. And we feel like we're being really targeted when we use those demographics. But the psychographics are the things that are important to that person. They're all the personality traits that make that person up. And that's the stuff that you need to be talking to create much more diverse thing. If you understand the psychographics, the psychological elements of the human, the things that they care about, you can create things that are catered very specifically towards them.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. I mean, you're right. I mean, most people will know about that whole sort of trying to profile a market, but then, from a psychological bit, which is the assumption they make around profiling, that you're looking at the psychological makeup of those individuals within that, or is it a case of no, that it doesn't look at that, or if it does, it's on such a superficial level that's questionable value in doing that, and that you do need to be thinking this differently. And it's, for me, it's almost the sense of, are you tinkering around the edges when you're trying to influence behavior, or are you taking a radical approach?
I would always side with the radical approach. And I'd side with the radical approach because it makes the choice easy. If you make a choice for your consumer a bit they're not going to make the decision. That's just the way the brain works. It's going to go, that's not a good use of my time. I'm not going to choose between that. But if you make it really obvious and you make it really clear, you're going to have that choice, whether it's yes or no. You never want an choice and the choice never to actually happen. So I'd always side with the radical approach where you go all the way in and you figure out exactly what it is that makes that human being tick, what's keeping them up at night, what are their big concerns, what combines them, what is the label that all the labelless people have that brings them together. Figure out what that core nub of who they are from that psychological perspective is. And utilize that to communicate with them. That's why you build relationships and friendships, because you can get down to that level of detail and you see yourself in that other person, and that's precisely what you want to do.
Awesome. Thank you very much for your time, Kenda. I really enjoyed having that conversation. Brilliant.
It was absolutely great. Really, really enjoyed that. I love having my brain picked and challenged. It's fantastic. Thank you.
Hi there. Well, I'm sure that just like me, you would have found Kenda really, really interesting. I think really important to me when I kicked off my research into the human factor, it's just like that understanding of what it means to be human. And when you get to understand what it means to be human, then you're able to design with the human in mind. And so big part of what we wanted to do in the podcast, and we're definitely doing with the likes of guests like Kenda, is bringing people who understand what it means to be human and are using that to design what it is that they do. And Kenda does email campaigns, and man, who doesn't use email here listening, to communicate with people, to help raise awareness, to help potentially influence behavior. And so it just made absolute sense to bring Kenda onto the show. Digital marketing is really important, and I've learned so much through understanding digital marketing more effectively, and I use that to help organizations better design their internal email campaigns. So I hope you really got something out of that. So if you find those types of insights interesting, if you think that your organization yourself could potentially benefit from understanding those insights more broadly and probably in a more structured format, then how can you do that? How is best for you to access all the insights we've developed? Well, I run a number of public workshops in the UK, in Europe, and further afield. And those workshops start with a one-day workshop where we just blow your mind and strip back every assumption that you've ever made around awareness, behavior, and culture, and really, really throw some huge insights that we've gained from 7.5 years worth of research into the equation, all the way through to 3-day courses looking at the Sayback framework. That's our own framework for setting a vision or a strategy for the human factor. We also, for those people who want to get all their stakeholders to an event, who want to maybe discuss their own good points and bad points within their own organizations, but want to do that in a confidential manner, we also run in-house workshops as well. And we run them throughout the UK and Europe and further afield. So if you have an interest in being challenged around the human factor, if you're at a point where you're coming up for a strategic review around the human factor and you want to sort of rethink, maybe you're at the beginning of actually planning your next 3-year strategy, then maybe get in contact with us about the in-house workshops as well. The other way that you can engage with us around the insights is our benchmarking exercise. So we developed the SABAC framework. And the SABAC framework is an excellent way of sort of defining where you want to be, assessing where you are, and then coming up with a plan about actually, how you're going to achieve those lofty goals of awareness, behavior, and culture. So, we can do that for you as well. And the final thing is, I just believe that a lot of what we've done is to do all the research and gather all these insights and to sort of see them within the context of information security and data protection. And actually, what we'd like to do for as many people as possible is to provide shortcuts. So that's quick shortcuts to insights around all elements of the research that we've done, and allowing you to be able to choose which bits are most interested to you, but also the best consumed for you. Now, we're going to be relaunching something a little bit later in 2020, but we're taking interest from people. If you want to know more about what it is that I'm doing, the best way to do is contact me through I want to know more at re-thinkingthehumanfactor.com. Let me repeat that again. I want to know more at re-thinkingthehumanfactor.com, and I'll try to get back to you. So who do we have on the show next? Well, the person that's on the next show is a great guy called Chris Fleming. I met Chris a couple of years ago, and Chris did a presentation back in 2019 at the SANS Summit in London. And in that presentation, he talked about marginal gains, so the opportunity for marginal gains within the context of the human factor. And anybody who knows me will know that I'm a huge fan of marginal gains. So we just had to get Chris on the show. But also Chris just uses an analogy so well in this interview. Absolutely fantastic. So please come and join us. Chris and I are going to talk about marginal gains, what it means, and actually how it could potentially be applied. Fantastic interview. So please do join us in only a week. So thank you for joining us on the show, and I look forward to catching up with you next week. Cheers.